The math doesn't work. 2,700 Japanese soldiers, 33 Marines. That's 82 enemies for every single American. The Japanese commander looks at those numbers and sees a guaranteed victory, a slaughter, a footnote in history. But one sergeant looks at those same numbers and says, they're not getting through. For the next 10 hours, he turns a machine gun into a wall of fire. Bodies pile up in front of his position. His gun barrel glows red. His hands burn. He keeps shooting. When the sun rises, the Japanese force is shattered, and this sergeant is standing on a pile of 950 enemy dead. This is the night they try to break the Marines. This is the night one man said no. Before we get into the carnage and chaos of that October night in 1942, you need to understand why Guadalcanal mattered. Because this wasn't just some random Pacific island that happened to see fighting. This was the hinge point of the entire Pacific War. This was where America stopped retreating and started advancing. This was where the Japanese juggernaut finally hit something it couldn't crush. Let me set the stage properly. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and launched simultaneous invasions across the Pacific. Within 6 months, they had conquered an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Their Zero fighters dominated the skies. Their long-lance torpedoes sank Allied ships with terrifying efficiency. Their soldiers fought with a fanaticism that shocked Western observers. The rising sun was ascending, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. But there was a problem with Japan's strategy, and that problem was geography. Japan needed oil to run its war machine. The oil came from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. To protect the oil shipments, Japan needed to control the sea lanes between Indonesia and the home islands. And to control those sea lanes, Japan needed to prevent the Allies from establishing bases close enough to threaten Japanese shipping. Australia was the obvious threat. If the Americans and Australians could build up forces in Australia and then establish forward bases in the island chains to the north, they could strangle Japan's oil supply. The Japanese solution was to push their defensive perimeter as far south as possible, establishing bases that would keep Allied forces at arm's length. And one of the most important positions in this defensive perimeter was a place called Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a mountainous, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain, about 1,000 miles northeast of Australia. In July 1942, American reconnaissance discovered that the Japanese were building an airfield there. If that airfield became operational, Japanese bombers and fighters could threaten Allied shipping routes to Australia. The supply line that kept Australia in the war would be cut. The strategic situation was clear. The Japanese could not be allowed to complete that airfield. Someone had to take it from them. The someone was the United States Marine Corps. On August 7th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. It was a chaotic, improvised assault. The Marines had limited intelligence about the Japanese strength on the island. Their maps were inaccurate. Their supplies were inadequate. 2 days after the landing, the U.S. Navy was forced to withdraw after a devastating defeat at the Battle of Savo Island, leaving the Marines stranded with minimal supplies and no naval support. What followed was 6 months of hell. The Marines captured the airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, but they couldn't leave. And the Japanese couldn't accept losing it. Both sides poured reinforcements into the island. The Americans by day, when their aircraft from Henderson Field could provide cover. The Japanese by night, using fast destroyer convoys that the Marines called the Tokyo Express. Guadalcanal became a grinding battle of attrition. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases killed almost as many men as Japanese bullets. The Marines lived in mud, ate cold rations, and fought an enemy that attacked relentlessly from the jungle. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and forgotten by an American public focused on Europe. And somehow they held. Now, let me introduce you to the hero of this story, because John Basilone's background is as remarkable as his battlefield performance. He was born on November 4th, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. His father, Salvatore Basilone, had come to America from Naples. His mother, Dora, raised 10 children in a crowded household. John was the sixth of those 10 children, and from an early age, he was different from his siblings. He wasn't interested in school. He wasn't interested in settling down. He was interested in adventure. At 15, Basilone dropped out of school and worked odd jobs. At 18, he enlisted in the United States Army. The Army sent him to the Philippines, where he served for 3 years with the 31st Infantry Regiment. In the Philippines, Basilone discovered two things. He loved military life, and he was very, very good at fighting. He became a skilled boxer, winning numerous matches in military competitions. The physical aggression, the quick reflexes, and the absolute refusal to quit are these qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. When his army enlistment ended in 1937, Basilone returned home. But civilian life didn't suit him. He worked as a truck driver, but he missed the military. In 1940, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, Basilone enlisted again, this time in the United States Marine Corps. The Marines recognized Basilone's talent immediately. He excelled at infantry training. He became an expert with every weapon the Marines used, and he showed a particular aptitude for machine guns. The Marine Corps trained its machine gunners intensively because machine guns were force multipliers. A single machine gun, properly positioned and operated, could stop an infantry assault in its tracks. The rate of fire, the sustained killing power, and the psychological impact on attacking troops. Machine guns had dominated battlefields since World War I. Basilone didn't just learn to operate machine guns. He learned to love them. He understood the weapons at an intuitive level, knowing their quirks, their failure points, and their capabilities. He could field strip a Browning .30 caliber machine gun blindfolded. He could clear jams under fire. He could keep a gun running when other gunners would have given up. The Marines promoted him to sergeant and assigned him to lead a machine gun section. When the 1st Marine Division shipped out for Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942, Sergeant John Basilone was ready. He just didn't know what he was ready for. Let me describe the tactical situation on Guadalcanal in October 1942, because understanding the terrain and the forces involved is essential to understanding what Basilone did. Henderson Field sat on a coastal plain on Guadalcanal's northern shore. The Marines had established a perimeter around the airfield, creating a roughly oval defensive zone about 4 miles long and 2 miles wide. This perimeter was defended by whatever units were available: Marines who had landed in August, reinforcements who had arrived since, and even some Army units that had been thrown into the fight. The perimeter was not a continuous line of trenches like World War I. That would have required far more men than the Americans had available. Instead, the perimeter consisted of strong-point positions where machine guns, mortars, and rifle squads were dug in, connected by patrols and observation posts. The idea was that attacking forces would be detected by the observation posts, engaged by the strong points, and destroyed before they could reach the airfield. South of the perimeter, the jungle rose in steep ridges covered with impenetrable vegetation. The Japanese had been building up forces in this jungle for weeks, preparing for a massive assault. The man commanding these forces was Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakitake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army. Hayakitake had been ordered to retake Henderson Field at all costs. He had assembled approximately 20,000 troops for the offensive, including the veteran Sendai Division, one of the best infantry units in the Imperial Japanese Army. The plan was complex. Multiple columns would attack the American perimeter from different directions simultaneously. The main assault would come from the south, where the Sendai Division would smash through the thin American lines and capture the airfield. Japanese naval forces would provide support with bombardments, and once the airfield was taken, aircraft would fly in to cement Japanese control. Everything was ready. The date was set for October 23, 1942. But here's where the Japanese plan started to fall apart, and understanding this failure is crucial. The approach route for the main assault force led through some of the most difficult terrain on Guadalcanal. The Sendai Division had to march through miles of trackless jungle, up and down steep ridges, through streams and swamps. The soldiers carried heavy equipment: machine guns, mortars, ammunition through mud that sucked at their boots, and vegetation so thick they had to hack their way through with machetes. The march took far longer than anticipated. Units became separated. Communication broke down. By October 23rd, the Sendai Division was not in position. General Hyakutake pushed the attack date back by 1 day, then another day. Meanwhile, the Marines on the perimeter knew something was coming. Patrols encountered Japanese scouts. Native coast watchers reported enemy troop movements. The tension was unbearable. Everyone knew the Japanese were out there, preparing to attack. Nobody knew exactly when or where the blow would fall. The attack finally came on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, and it came against a sector of the perimeter defended by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, the unit that included Sergeant John Basilone and his machine gun section. Let me describe the position. The Marines were dug in along a ridge south of Henderson Field. The ridge was covered with kanai grass, tall, razor-sharp grass that blocked visibility and made movement difficult. Below the ridge, the ground sloped away into dense jungle. The Marines had cleared fields of fire in front of their positions, cutting down vegetation so they could see approaching enemies. Barbed wire had been strung. Machine gun positions had been dug with interlocking fields of fire. It was a strong position, but it was held by too few men. Basilone's machine gun section was responsible for a critical portion of the perimeter. He had 2 heavy water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns, Browning M1917A1S, and about 15 men to operate and defend them. These Browning machine guns were devastating weapons. They could fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute. The water cooling system allowed for sustained fire without the barrel overheating. Properly supplied with ammunition and water, a single Browning could hold off an infantry company. But Basilone didn't have just a company coming at him. He had a regiment. The attack began around 10 p.m. with Japanese artillery and mortar fire. Shells crashed into the Marine positions, showering the defenders with mud and shrapnel. The bombardment was designed to keep the Marines' heads down while the infantry moved into position. In the jungle below the ridge, thousands of Japanese soldiers were forming up for the assault. They fixed bayonets. Officers drew their swords. Men who knew they might not survive the night wrote final letters or said quiet prayers. And then, with screams of banzai, they charged. I need you to understand what a Japanese banzai charge looked like and felt like because it was unlike anything in Western military experience. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit over material. The fighting spirit of the Japanese soldier, they believed, could overcome any material disadvantage. When conventional tactics failed, Japanese commanders ordered massed infantry assaults, waves of soldiers charging directly into enemy fire, relying on sheer numbers and aggression to overwhelm the defenders. These charges were terrifying. Hundreds of men running at you through the darkness, screaming, bayonets gleaming in the muzzle flashes. The psychological pressure was immense. Many defenders broke and ran rather than face the onslaught. The Japanese counted on this. They expected that their fury would shatter enemy morale. But John Basilone didn't break. When the first wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle, he opened fire. The Browning machine gun roared to life, spitting tracers into the darkness. Around him, his men added their fire rifles, pistols, and the second machine gun. The noise was overwhelming. The muzzle flash from the machine gun illuminated the charging Japanese in strobe-like flickers, and the Japanese started falling. The first wave hit the barbed wire and became tangled. Basilone's fire cut them down. Bodies piled against the wire, creating obstacles for the men behind them. A second wave clambered over the dead and dying, still charging. Basilone kept firing. The barrel of the machine gun began to glow red from the heat. The water in the cooling jacket started to boil. Shell casings poured from the gun, forming a growing pile of brass. And still, more Japanese came. This is where the 10-hour battle began, and I need to walk you through in detail because the scale of what Basilone did is almost impossible to comprehend. The Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. One charge would be beaten back, and the survivors would retreat into the jungle. Then, minutes or hours later, another charge would begin. Each attack was preceded by that blood-curdling scream, "Bonsai," and then the thunder of feet rushing toward the Marine lines. Basilone fought through all of it. His first machine gun overheated despite the water cooling system. The sustained rate of fire was simply too much. When the barrel became too hot to function, Basilone didn't wait for it to cool. He cleared the jam, replaced worn parts, and did whatever was necessary to get the gun back in action. At times, he grabbed his backup weapon, a .45 caliber pistol, and shot Japanese soldiers at point-blank range when they reached his position. When his pistol ran dry, he used his machete. Around 2 a.m., the situation became critical. One of Basilone's machine gun positions had been overrun. The crew was dead or wounded. Japanese soldiers were pouring through the gap, threatening to roll up the entire defensive line. If that happened, the path to Henderson Field would be open. Basilone made a decision that should have gotten him killed. He grabbed his remaining operational machine gun, a weapon that weighed about 90 pounds with its tripod, and ran through the gap in the lines to a new position. He was completely exposed. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. Bullets cracked past him in the darkness. But he made it. He set up the gun and opened fire into the Japanese who had penetrated the perimeter, driving them back. Let me pause here to explain why this matters tactically. Machine guns are defensive weapons. They're heavy, they require setup time, and they're only effective when firing from a fixed position. Moving a machine gun during combat, especially at night, under fire, through broken terrain is insane. The gun is awkward, the tripod catches on everything, and you're completely defenseless while carrying it. Most men would have abandoned the weapon and fought with their rifle. Basilone carried the gun through the chaos because he understood something fundamental. The gun was more important than his life. A rifle could kill a few enemies. The machine gun could kill dozens. If Basilone died, but the gun survived and kept firing, his death would be worth it. That calculation, my life versus the mission, is what separates ordinary soldiers from Medal of Honor recipients. But Basilone didn't die. He got the gun into position, cleared a jam that had developed during the move, and resumed firing. The Japanese who had penetrated the perimeter were now trapped between Basilone's gun and the other Marine positions. They were slaughtered. The gap in the line was sealed. The crisis passed. For the moment. Throughout the night, Basilone also made multiple trips to the rear to bring up ammunition. His machine guns were eating through belts of ammunition at a terrifying rate. Each gun used 250-round fabric belts, and the guns could empty a belt in less than a minute of continuous fire. The ammunition supply point was hundreds of yards behind the front line. The route passed through areas where Japanese infiltrators were moving. Every ammunition run was a risk. Basilone made the runs anyway. He carried heavy boxes of ammunition through the mud and the darkness, delivered them to his gunners, and returned for more. How many trips he made is impossible to say, but every trip kept the guns firing at some point during the night. The exact time is unclear in the chaos of battle. Basilone took a wound. A piece of shrapnel or a bullet graze caught him in the arm. He ignored it. There was no time for medical attention. The Japanese were still attacking, still dying in front of his guns, still trying to break through. A wounded arm didn't change the tactical situation. So Basilone kept fighting. The blood mixed with the mud and the gun oil on his hands. His fingers cramped from the continuous firing. His ears rang from the endless roar of the weapon. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was keeping the gun firing. Let me describe what the Japanese experienced that night, because understanding their perspective illuminates just how devastating Basilone's defense was. The Sendai Division was one of the elite units of the Imperial Japanese Army. These were professional soldiers, many of them combat veterans from China. They had been trained to believe in the irresistible power of the Japanese infantry assault. They had been told that the American Marines were soft, undisciplined, and unable to withstand a determined attack. They expected to sweep over the American positions and capture Henderson Field by dawn. Instead, they ran into a wall of fire they couldn't breach. The terrain funneled the Japanese attacks into killing zones. The ridgeline that Basilone defended was one of the main approach routes to the airfield. The Japanese commanders sent wave after wave of soldiers up that ridge because it was the most direct path to their objective. And wave after wave was cut down by machine gun fire. After the first few assaults, the Japanese soldiers knew what awaited them at the top of that ridge. They could see the bodies of their comrades piling up in the barbed wire. They could hear the screams of the wounded lying in the grass, beyond help. They charged anyway because their officers ordered them to charge, and because Japanese military culture made retreat unthinkable. The discipline and courage of the Japanese soldiers that night were extraordinary. They kept attacking long after any rational assessment would have called for withdrawal. But discipline and courage couldn't overcome physics. A man running uphill through tangled grass, loaded down with equipment, silhouetted against the skyline, is an easy target for a machine gunner who knows his weapon. Basilone was killing Japanese soldiers as fast as they could climb the ridge. By dawn, the attacks had finally stopped. The Japanese commanders, recognizing the failure of the night assault, ordered their surviving troops to withdraw and regroup. The Sendai Division had suffered catastrophic casualties. Estimates range from 900 to 1,500 dead in the attacks on Basilone sector alone, with perhaps 2,500 total casualties across all the assault sectors. The unit was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. It would never recover. When the sun rose on October 25, 1942, Sergeant John Basilone was still at his gun. Around him lay the bodies of Japanese soldiers, by some accounts, more than 950 in front of his immediate position. The killing ground stretched down the slope of the ridge, a carpet of khaki-clad corpses tangled in the wire and scattered across the grass. Basilone's gun was still hot. His hands were blistered. His uniform was soaked with mud, blood, and sweat. He had been fighting for more than 10 hours straight, and the perimeter had held. Now I need to zoom out and explain why this mattered beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Battle of Henderson Field, also called the Battle for Henderson Field or the Battle of Lunga Point, was the climactic confrontation of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was Japan's last major attempt to retake the airfield by ground assault. The failure of the October 24th, 25 attacks broke the back of Japanese offensive capability on the island. After this night, the Japanese would never again mass enough forces to seriously threaten Henderson Field. The initiative passed permanently to the Americans. Think about what that means strategically. If the Japanese had broken through, if Basilone's section had collapsed, and the enemy had poured through the gap, Henderson Field would have fallen. Without the airfield, American aircraft couldn't operate in the Solomons. Without air cover, American supply ships couldn't reach Guadalcanal. Without supplies, the remaining Marines would have been annihilated. The American toehold in the South Pacific would have been eliminated. The entire Pacific counteroffensive would have been set back by months, perhaps years. One man didn't win the Battle of Henderson Field. Hundreds of Marines fought that night, and many of them died. The artillery that fired support missions throughout the night deserves credit. The other machine gun crews who held their positions deserve credit. The riflemen who killed Japanese soldiers with aimed fire deserve credit. But Basilone's sector held the most critical ground, faced the heaviest attacks, and produced the most enemy dead. His actions were the hinge on which the battle turned. If his guns had fallen silent, everything else might have been for nothing. John Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions on October 24th to 25th, 1942. The citation reads, in part, for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces above and beyond the call of duty. When the enemy broke through the line directly in front of his position, Sergeant Basilone, in a fierce frontal assault, personally cut down the enemy with his heavy machine gun, contributing in a large measure to the annihilation of the enemy regiment. Throughout this action, he continually exposed himself to hostile fire, and his great personal valor and courageous initiative were in a large measure responsible for the successful defense of the perimeter. But the Medal of Honor doesn't capture the full story. It doesn't describe the 10 hours of continuous combat. It doesn't mention the ammunition runs through enemy-infested darkness. It doesn't talk about carrying a 90-pound machine gun through a gap in the lines while Japanese soldiers fired at him from all directions. It doesn't convey the heat of the barrel, the blisters on his hands, the pile of bodies in front of his position. Medal citations are by necessity brief. They summarize heroism in a few sentences. But heroism, like Basilone's, can't really be summarized. It has to be described in full, hour by hour, shot by shot, to be truly understood. Let me tell you what happened to John Basilone after Guadalcanal, because his story doesn't end on that blood-soaked ridge. After the battle, Basilone became famous. He was pulled off the front lines and sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. The Marine Corps needed heroes to sell bonds and boost morale, and Basilone was the perfect hero, handsome, charismatic Italian-American in an era when the country was fighting Italy as well as Japan. He could represent American diversity and American valor at the same time. Basilone hated it. He was a Marine. He was a warrior. He wanted to be with his men, in combat, doing the only job he had ever loved. Instead, he was giving speeches, shaking hands, kissing babies, pretending to smile while inside he burned with frustration. The bond tour took him across America. He met celebrities. He met politicians. He met the public that had been reading about his exploits in the newspapers. Everyone wanted a piece of John Basilone, the hero of Guadalcanal, the machine gunner who had killed 1,000 Japanese. And all Basilone wanted was to go back to the war. He asked to be returned to combat. The Marine Corps said no. He was too valuable as a propaganda tool. He asked again. They said no again. He kept asking. Finally, after more than a year of bond tours and training assignments, the Marine Corps relented. Sergeant John Basilone was assigned to the 5th Marine Division, which was training for a new operation, the invasion of Iwo Jima. He knew what he was getting into. Iwo Jima was going to be a bloodbath. The Japanese had fortified the island with thousands of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions. American intelligence estimated that taking Iwo Jima would cost 15,000 casualties. That estimate would prove to be optimistic. Basilone didn't care. He was going back to war. Before shipping out, Basilone did something unexpected. He got married. Her name was Lena May Ridgey, a Marine Corps sergeant he had met at Camp Pendleton. They married on July 10, 1944, just months before Basilone left for the Pacific. It was a whirlwind romance, compressed by the urgency of wartime. Basilone knew he might not come back. He married Lena anyway, giving her what time he could, knowing it might be all the time they would ever have. On February 19, 1945, the 5th Marine Division landed on Iwo Jima. The beaches were a nightmare. Japanese artillery and mortars rained down on the exposed Marines. The volcanic sand was so soft that vehicles bogged down and men struggled to walk. Bodies piled up at the waterline. Units that had trained together were shattered within minutes of landing. John Basilone, now a gunnery sergeant, led his machine gun platoon through the chaos. He did what he had always done. He led from the front, exposing himself to enemy fire, using his weapons expertise to destroy Japanese positions that were pinning down his men. At some point during that first day, Basilone reached the edge of one of Iwo Jima's airfields. Japanese bunkers overlooking the airfield were firing on the Marines. Basilone personally attacked one of these bunkers, destroying it with grenades and demolition charges. He got his men off the beach and moving toward their objectives. He was doing everything right, fighting with the same skill and courage that had earned him the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. And then a Japanese mortar round landed near him. John Basilone was killed on February 19, 1945, the first day of the Battle of Iwo Jima. He was 27 years old. He had been married for 7 months. He had been a Medal of Honor recipient for less than 3 years. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on Iwo Jima, an unusual recognition, since the Navy Cross is typically not given to those who already hold the Medal of Honor. But Basilone's heroism that day was so exceptional that the Marine Corps felt compelled to honor it separately. John Basilone remains the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Let me talk about the aftermath of Basilone's death, because the Marine Corps and the nation mourned him as a symbol of everything they were fighting for. His widow, Lena, received the Navy Cross on his behalf. She never remarried. She spent the rest of her life preserving John's memory, speaking about his service, and connecting with the Marines who had served with him. She died in 1999, more than 54 years after her husband. They had been married for less than a year, but she carried his memory for half a century. The Marine Corps named a destroyer after Basilone, the USS Basilone, DD 824, commissioned in 1949. The ship served for more than 25 years before being decommissioned. There are streets named after Basilone in multiple cities. There are VFW posts, monuments, and memorial funds bearing his name. In his hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, there's an annual parade in his honor, the only parade in America dedicated to a single enlisted service member. For decades after his death, John Basilone remained one of the most famous Marines in history. His story was taught to new recruits as an example of what a Marine should be. His image appeared on war bond posters and recruiting materials. He became, in death, even more of a symbol than he had been in life. I want to return now to the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, and talk about what we can learn from it. Because John Basilone's stand on that ridge isn't just a war story. It's a lesson about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. The first lesson is about preparation. Basilone didn't become a machine gun expert overnight. He had years of training and practice. He knew his weapons better than he knew himself. When the crisis came, he didn't have to think about how to operate the gun, how to clear jams, or how to distribute fire. All of that was automatic. This freed his conscious mind to focus on the tactical situation, to make decisions about where to position the gun, when to move, and how to coordinate with the rest of his section. The lesson is clear. Excellence in crisis comes from preparation beforehand. You can't become competent under fire. You have to be competent before the fire starts. The second lesson is about leadership. Basilone didn't just fight his own position. He ran ammunition. He moved a machine gun through enemy fire to plug a gap. He coordinated with other Marines along the line. He did whatever was necessary to keep the defense intact, even when it meant exposing himself to danger. This is what leadership looks like in combat. Not staying safe in the rear, but being where the crisis is worst and doing whatever needs to be done. Basilone's Medal of Honor citation mentions that his actions were, in a large measure, responsible for the successful defense of the perimeter. That's not because he personally killed every Japanese soldier. It's because his leadership held the line together when it was on the verge of breaking. The third lesson is about commitment. Basilone could have retreated. When his position was being overrun, he could have fallen back to secondary positions. When his guns were overheating, he could have concluded that sustained defense was impossible. When he was wounded, he could have sought medical attention. At every point, there were rational reasons to do less than he did. He rejected all of them. He had decided that the Japanese were not getting through, and he held to that decision regardless of the cost. This kind of commitment, absolute, unwavering, willing to pay any price, is rare. Most people, in most situations, will find reasons to moderate their commitment, to accept less than total outcomes, to compromise. Basilone didn't compromise. He gave everything he had, and it was enough. The fourth lesson is about what one person can accomplish. The odds against Basilone were absurd. 82-1, by the most extreme calculation. No reasonable person would have bet on those odds. The Japanese certainly didn't think they could lose. But one man, in the right position, with the right skills and the right determination, changed the outcome. This doesn't mean that one person can do anything. Basilone had advantages. He had the defensive position, he had the weapon, and he had supporting fire from other Marines. But he maximized those advantages. He squeezed every ounce of effectiveness from the resources he had, and that made the difference. Let me talk about the Japanese side of this battle, because their perspective is often overlooked in American accounts. The soldiers of the Sendai Division were not robotic fanatics. They were human beings, farmers, fishermen, factory workers. drafted into the Imperial Army and sent to die on a jungle island they had never heard of. Many of them had families back in Japan. Many of them knew, as they climbed that ridge into the machine gun fire, that they would not survive. They went anyway because their culture and their training demanded it. The Japanese military code emphasized death before dishonor. Surrender was forbidden. The retreat was shameful. The only acceptable outcomes were victory or death. This code produced extraordinary courage. The Japanese soldiers who kept charging into Basilone's fire, wave after wave, were as brave as any soldiers in history. But it also produced extraordinary waste. The Sendai Division was destroyed not because its soldiers were cowards, but because they were ordered to attack an impregnable position with no regard for casualties. The Japanese commanders sacrificed their men's lives for an objective that could not be achieved. That's not strategy, that's murder. The waste of Japanese lives on Guadalcanal was staggering. Across the entire campaign, from August 1942 to February 1943, Japan lost approximately 30,000 men, about 20,000 killed in combat, and 10,000 dead from disease and starvation. American losses were about 7,000 total. The disparity reflects the different ways the two sides fought. The Americans used firepower and logistics, while the Japanese used spirit and sacrifice. Firepower 1. The lesson of Guadalcanal, which the Japanese high command never fully absorbed, was that courage is not enough. You can't charge into machine gun fire and expect to win through willpower. You can't sustain an offensive when you can't supply your troops. You can't defeat an enemy who has more guns, more ammunition, more ships, more aircraft, and more men. The Japanese spirit was magnificent, but it couldn't overcome American material superiority. I want to zoom out even further and talk about what Guadalcanal meant for the Pacific War as a whole. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been on the offensive everywhere. They had conquered half the Pacific and seemed unstoppable. After Guadalcanal, the initiative passed to the Americans. Japan was now on the defensive, trying to hold an overextended empire against an enemy with superior resources. The turning point wasn't a single battle. It was a 6-month campaign of grinding attrition. But within that campaign, certain moments stand out. The Battle of Henderson Field was one of those moments. If the October attacks had succeeded, the entire Guadalcanal campaign might have been lost. If Guadalcanal had been lost, the American advance across the Pacific would have been delayed by months, perhaps years. If the advance had been delayed, the war would have lasted longer. More people would have died. The atomic bombs might have been used on different targets or not at all. History would have changed in ways we can barely imagine. John Basilone didn't know any of this as he fought through that October night. He wasn't thinking about grand strategy or the fate of nations. He was thinking about the Japanese soldiers in front of him, the ammunition in his gun, the men counting on him to hold the line. That's how history is made, by individuals making individual decisions in moments of crisis, without knowing how their choices will ripple outward through time. Basilone chose to fight rather than retreat. He chose to keep firing when his gun overheated. He chose to carry ammunition through the darkness. He chose to stay at his post for 10 hours straight. And those choices, multiplied by similar choices from thousands of other Americans on Guadalcanal, added up to victory. Let me tell you about the machine gun that Basilone used, because the weapon itself deserves recognition. The Browning M1917A1 was a water-cooled heavy machine gun designed by John Browning in 1917, hence the name. It fired .30-06 caliber ammunition, the same cartridge used by American infantry rifles. The gun weighed about 100 pounds with its tripod, water, and ammunition. It required a crew of 3 or 4 to operate effectively, a gunner, an assistant gunner, and 1 or 2 ammunition carriers. The water cooling system was the gun's distinctive feature. A metal jacket surrounded the barrel, filled with about 7 pints of water. As the barrel heated up from firing, the water absorbed the heat and eventually turned to steam, which vented through a tube. This allowed the gun to fire continuously for extended periods without the barrel overheating and warping. In theory, a properly supplied M1917A1 could fire indefinitely. In practice, even water cooling had limits. The sustained fire that Basilone maintained that night pushed the gun to its absolute maximum. The water boiled away. The barrel began to overheat anyway. But Basilone kept it running. The M1917A1 was not a mobile weapon. It was designed for fixed defensive positions. Moving it during combat was difficult and dangerous. The gunner had to lift the gun off the tripod, carry the 32-pound receiver to the new position, and then carry the 53-pound tripod separately. Meanwhile, he was completely defenseless. This is why Basilone's movement of the gun through enemy fire was so remarkable. He did something the weapon was never designed to do, in conditions that should have made it impossible. I want to talk about the human body's response to sustained combat, because what Basilone endured for those 10 hours was physiologically extraordinary. Combat triggers the body's stress response. Adrenaline floods the system, heart rate spikes, peripheral vision narrows, and fine motor skills degrade. In short bursts, this response is helpful. It increases strength and speed, reduces sensitivity to pain, and focuses attention on immediate threats. But the stress response is not designed to last for 10 hours. Sustained combat produces exhaustion at every level. The muscles fatigue from constant exertion. The mind becomes overloaded from continuous decision-making. The adrenal glands deplete their reserves. After several hours of intense combat, most soldiers experience a kind of stupor, slow reactions, impaired judgment, and difficulty focusing. This is the body's way of forcing rest. Basilone fought through this. He maintained his performance throughout the night, never slowing, never making critical errors. How he did this is unclear. Some people seem to have an exceptional ability to function under prolonged stress. Whether this is genetic, trained, or some combination of both is not fully understood. But whatever the mechanism, Basilone had it. He fought at peak effectiveness for far longer than human physiology should allow. Let me return to the moment when dawn broke on October 25, 1942. The firing had stopped. The Japanese were gone, retreating into the jungle, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The Marines who had survived the night emerged from their positions to survey the carnage. What they saw was almost beyond comprehension. Bodies everywhere. Japanese soldiers hanging on the barbed wire, slumped in shell craters, scattered across the grass. The dead were so numerous that the Marines couldn't count them accurately. Estimates range from 900 to over 1,500 in the immediate area of Basilone's section. The smell was already becoming unbearable as the tropical sun began its work on the corpses. Basilone was still at his gun. His hands were blistered and bleeding. His uniform was unrecognizable, caked with mud and blood. His arm was wounded, but he was alive. Around him, his section had suffered casualties, some killed, some wounded, but the guns were still operational. The position had held. Later that morning, the Marines began the grim work of burying the dead. There were too many Japanese bodies to bury individually, so they were collected in mass graves. American dead were recovered and given individual burials, with chaplains performing services as time allowed. The living were fed, given water, and allowed to rest, the first real rest any of them had gotten in more than 24 hours. In the days that followed, the full scope of the Japanese defeat became clear. The Sendai Division had been effectively destroyed. Japanese commanders admitted privately that Guadalcanal could no longer be taken by ground assault. They would continue to fight, continue to send reinforcements, and continue to contest the island for another 3 months. But the battle was already lost. The Marines had held. Henderson Field remained American. The turning point had passed. I want to conclude by talking about what John Basilone represents. He wasn't a strategist or a general. He didn't make the decisions that shaped the Pacific War. He was a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, the backbone of every military force, the man who translates orders into action. He did his job extraordinarily well, in conditions that would have broken most people, and his excellence made the difference between victory and defeat. Every military force needs John Basilone. They need men and women who master their craft, who lead by example, who refuse to quit when everything is falling apart. The generals get the headlines and the history books, but it's the sergeants who win the battles. This has been true in every war, in every army throughout human history. The Battle of Henderson Field was won by generals planning the defense, by admirals keeping the supply lines open, and by pilots flying support missions. But it was also won by a sergeant with a machine gun who decided that 2,700 Japanese soldiers were not going to get past him. That's the story. 33 Marines against 2,700 Japanese. 10 hours of continuous combat. 950 enemy dead in front of one position. One sergeant who refused to break. John Basilone didn't just fight that night. He became the embodiment of Marine Corps values. Courage, commitment, faithfulness, and a relentless pursuit of mission accomplishment. He became a symbol that continues to inspire Marines today, 8 decades later. And he showed what one person can do when they decide that failure is not an option. So yeah, now you know how 33 Marines stopped 2,700 Japanese soldiers. You know about John Basilone, the machine gunner who became a legend. You know about the Battle of Henderson Field and why it mattered. You know about the 10 hours of hell that changed the course of the Pacific War. And you know that sometimes the impossible is just something that hasn't been done yet. You're welcome. That's going to cost you 1 subscription, or drop a comment telling me which World War II story you want to hear next. If you want more on the Pacific War, click the video right here. Because Basilone wasn't the only Marine who did the impossible, and the next video explains who else refused to quit when everyone said it couldn't be done.